Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Humanities Forum of 2025. You all are the cutting-edge crowd, right? Not the end-of-year, desperate, extra credit, packing the halls crowd of late December. Legit. All right. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I'm the coordinator of the forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities program bringing scholars, journalists, thinkers, academics from around the country and around the world to campus so that you can hear new ideas, explore diverse perspectives, deepen your intellectual life outside of class, and do it all within our community. The format, if you haven't been to one of these before, is we'll hear from our speaker, talk for about 45 minutes, after which there's a Q&A period, and you should know that it falls upon a student to ask the first question. So during Q&A, you can't wait for your profs. It's going to be you. What I do ask you to do is, when you've raised your hand, you've got that question formulated, you wait for the microphone to get to you, and just introduce yourself. Just say, my name is Ian, and I'm an English major, or whatever it is, right? So Q&A wraps up at like 4:45, pretty sharp, after which there's a reception down the hall in the great room, and we've got some pretty nice, morsels, heavy hors d'oeuvres, I think they're called in the business world, which sounds a little gross, but is actually really delicious. So, join us for that. In the meantime, here's what you need to do. You need to close down those beautiful electronics you got, going back to the old school of pencil and paper, or pen and paper. I know. But you know what? It's a way that you can actually be in the room and not skittering all over the globe. And I think, so it's, okay, so you put away your stuff, you ask the first question, you go down the hall for the reception. I think that's all you need to know. Let me pass the microphone to my colleague in history, Dr. Breen, who's going to introduce our speaker.
It's my great, excuse me. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Jonathan Schroeder, a professor at RISD. So we get people from all over the world, and sometimes we get people from just around the corner. It's nice. Jonathan Schroeder's a professor in English and literary arts and studies. He's taught at RISD, Brandeis, Warwick, and that followed his education. He went undergrad, Dartmouth, Brown, so he's got this deep Rhode Island connection, and then got his PhD from the University of Chicago. His intellectual work is diverse. His first book, as I think it is the one, Ahab Unbound, Melville and the Materialist Turn, which is trying to understand the interaction of man and nature. That came out of the University of Minnesota. Today, though, we're going to be looking at a different source. His interests are varied, wide and varied, and this is really a remarkable work, and I'm glad you guys are here to hear this. He found a new slave narrative. Slave narrative is an important genre for people who teach English, a very important genre for people like me who teach history. This is a really interesting thing, to get the first-person accounts and reflections on slavery. We don't get many new slave narratives, right? They're mostly there. They're mostly available on a website called Documenting the South at UNC. Wonderful thing if you ever need to do a research project and want to do one on slave sources, go there. But he found one, and maybe he'll tell us how he found it, I don't know. I haven't heard the story yet. But he found one that was published in Australia in 1855. It was published in a newspaper in Australia and has been undiscovered since then. And so now, this was published last year as a book out of the University of Chicago, by the University of Chicago Press. So this is a really exciting discovery, and this has gotten a lot of attention in the media. In fact, it was sort of weird how it came out. Usually, what people like us do is we just talk for like a year about, we got a book coming out, by the way. We're gonna, and we tell everyone we know, like, by the way, talk it up. You guys had a pretty good embargo going on where people weren't talking about it, and then the news came out, and it was in the New York Times when this book got released, and has been covered many other places, including All Things Considered, the Boston Globe, WNYC, and other places. So he's really gotten some traction with this work. It's a really interesting work. It's really recent work that he's been taking out. And he will tell us about that today. He has a couple other works in project. Again, as you would expect, they are interesting and diverse. One is on his Laurent Berlant, his major professor, his dissertation advisor at the University of Chicago, an important figure in the academy. And another one is Prisoners of Loss, an Atlantic history of nostalgia, which is under contract with Harvard University Press. He's got really interesting work. He's really got diverse interest. And he's got one more interest that I'll mention, which is he started, I think, right, co-founded the Congress of the Birds, which is a Rhode Island 501c3, which is a charity that is about rescuing, rehabilitating, and releasing wild birds. And they've done that they're engaged in building a land center, a 42-acre forest in Chepachet, Rhode Island. So if you are a birder interested in birds, I encourage you to come join us at that reception afterwards and talk about it. That'll certainly be interesting. But with no further ado, I will turn the mic over to Professor Schroeder to talk about John Swanson Jacobs' narrative. Thank you.
I've got this.
Oh, you got that?
Yeah. But yeah, thank you for that gracious introduction, and which I guess also serves as a segue to say that you want to volunteer and help save wild animals. You don't have to talk about this book with me. You could just talk about that. Last year we saved 2,000 of Rhode Island's wild birds. Not my partner and I alone. We have about 50 people working with us. But I'm also delighted to be here to talk to you about John Jacobs and about his remarkable autobiography. Published in an Australian newspaper in 1855. This is the first time since 1855, this past year, that we've actually been, as Americans, or people who live in America, able to reckon and engage with his language to ask, what does it mean? What is its significance? And why should we be paying attention to this forthright, outspoken, unapologetic, unfiltered autobiography? One thing I'm probably going to be saying in many ways over and over again is that a book like this, published outside of the US, in many ways teaches us that what is permissible to say and to write in the US is not as broad and wide a bandwidth as we might be led to think when we think of America as a democracy. That the limits on civic speech affect people, and they affect people differently, depending on who you are, what kind of identities you inhabit, and so on. So to speak and write as a black man in America means that you might be subject to different repercussions than if I were to speak and write, or if you occupy any other different kind of positions, if you were to speak and write. There might be more threat involved. There might be the threat of violence. There might be the kind of emotional threat that opening yourself up in public creates. John Jacobs' autobiography and the lives he lived that didn't make it into the pages of his autobiography, because this is two books in one. This is his autobiography, and then this is the biography that I wrote about him, to explain why he's so remarkable in ways that are invisible in the autobiography. These different lives serve as important sites of memory and counter-memory that I believe we need to recall today. The title of his autobiography, The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, remains arguably as relevant today as when it was first published in 1855. Rather than succumb to political disappointment and despair, this is a text, and this might be why it's relevant today, that trains us to challenge this nation's authoritarian history. It teaches us also that if on social media we get the usually overly dramatized, exaggerated claims that everything is new all the time, that actually America has had a long authoritarian history that goes alongside its democratic history. For John Jacobs, the story of America is not the story of the expansion of democracy and the overcoming of the nation's original sin. It's not about the expansion of civil rights and the gradual enfranchisement of all people who live here. Rather, his is a story of a nation founded on two experiments at once, one in democracy, the other in tyranny. And right now, at a moment when inequality, to speak of nothing but just inequality, is at its most extreme, more extreme than even in the era that was associated with robber barons and was called the Gilded Age, we can say that we know all too well which one of these experiments is winning. And as has been mentioned, I stumbled upon this work in an Australian archive in 2016. I actually remember the day, October 26, 2016, because it was like 11:30. I had a job application due at midnight. I had hit send, finished like tweaking the same cover letter that I'd been writing for like 3 months, as if that was going to make a difference. And because if you do a PhD, you're trained to be a masochist, I decided that the best way to blow off steam would be then to do some research. I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. But when I found this narrative, it had been lost since 1855, and lost in part because what happens to old newspapers when they're no longer new? Well, physical newspapers wind up, if they're saved at all, in libraries, attics, and probably auctions or wherever else old newspapers go. As an Americanist, meaning someone who studies the history and literature and culture of America, or more broadly, the Americas, I immediately knew that this was a super important discovery. For John Jacobs was not just someone who was coming out of the distance completely anonymous. He was the brother of Harriet Jacobs and the friend and ally of Frederick Douglass, which is another way of saying the two most important black authors of the 19th century, arguably some of the most important authors in American history, and the authors of the most widely read and studied autobiographical slave narratives, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. There's an irony in that last part of that title. And Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Another irony, that there would be slavery in a democratic country. Many of you here have read these works. If you haven't, you've also likely encountered their influence without realizing it, because they inform works by authors and artists like Toni Morrison, N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy is an amazing work of sci-fi and fantasy, Colson Whitehead, Simone Lee, the artist who represented America at the Venice Biennale, the last Venice Biennale, Glenn Ligon, and Torquay Dyson. Douglass and Harriet Jacobs' narratives have emerged over the past half-century as radiant objects for understanding men's and women's lives under slavery, the problems awaiting African Americans after slavery, and the potential of black lives to thrive against the odds. Since writing his narrative, however, John Jacobs has become, or had become, a footnote in his sister Harriet's life. Yet during his own life, he once stood side by side with some of the most important and daring transatlantic abolitionists of his day: William and Ellen Craft, Martin Delany, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, George Thompson, and others, on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US and the UK, because he led a life that was not only daring, but also largely a life where he was working outside the US. And that daring life outside America is one that we have precious few opportunities to learn about. The story that I'm telling is also a story really about what can you do with the technology you have. When documents start to get digitized, well, then all of a sudden, that old newspaper lost in a stack becomes findable again, because we have that Apple F or that Control F or that search function. We can search for keywords. We can use more creative ways of finding texts that a scholar working 30 years ago would have just thrown their hands up, because what are you going to do when faced with tens of billions of words? Your life would be spent just combing through a newspaper and finding not what you want. John Jacobs, however, as I'm now saying, was not just Frederick Douglass's ally, not just Harriet Jacobs's brother. He was also remarkable in his own right. And that's kind of what this slide starts to hint at. We see an amazing rediscovered daguerreotype of Frederick Douglass in the middle. We see the only known image of his sister, Harriet Jacobs, from 1890, I think 1890 or 1887, when she's in her 80s. And then we see the only known image of John Jacobs, or what I think is the only known image. This is a portrait painted in 1848. And the process of figuring out how do you know what someone looks like if you have no photographs of them or no portraits of them, and you just have a little bit of scraps of text that say, oh, he had light-colored skin and could pass for Italian. That's kind of analogous to what it means to write a biography of someone who's been lost to history. How can you really say what someone was like? How can you even sketch the outlines of that person's life? Yet the outlines are remarkable. A self-emancipated slave and a transatlantic abolitionist, a sailor on 4 oceans, a resident of 4 continents. John Jacobs was an African ex-American who chose to become a citizen of the world rather than remain in a nation that had enslaved 6 generations of his family and was not about to grant citizenship to him. By 1855, when his autobiography was published in Sydney, he had given up a promising career as an abolitionist. And that word abolitionist, we might just say that that's a synonym for someone who seeks to bring about the end of an injustice. Someone who, when we say an anti-slavery activist, that's only one type of abolitionist. There are prison abolitionists today who seek to bring about the end of the warehousing of people in prisons without any real effort to actually rehabilitate those people. By 1855, he had given up this promising career. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is one of the most heinous laws passed in American history, which commanded and compelled everyone in America to help Southern slave owners recapture their escaped slaves, including what would have been all of us in the North. That act confronted him with a terrible choice. Either betray the radical abolitionist credo, no union with slaveholders, by letting others purchase his freedom, which would represent kind of a union with slaveholders, because to give money to someone who practices slavery, who is a slave owner, is to indirectly endorse or condone it, to say that it is okay to value someone's life in dollars and cents and to buy and sell them. So he didn't want to do that. because that would be to betray one of the core principles of his ethics and his political philosophy. But also, what about if he continued to speak in public? Every time, and he gave hundreds, probably 500, 600 speeches in public against slavery, telling his life story, telling the story that becomes the autobiography in print. To do so would be to risk re-enslavement. A slave catcher hired by someone in the South could come to a talk like this and come through the door and try to drag him off into a waiting vehicle. So John Jacobs chose a third way. He left America. He fell back on the one trade that he knew would take men of color like him, the sea, sailing. And this is the career that gives him mobility. It gives him the kind of mobility that is usually enjoyed by people with wealth, with the ability to travel, with a passport, with all of the documents and privileges and affluence that's necessary to, say, take a vacation somewhere far away. He's not going to take a vacation. He's going to work his way to somewhere far away. I'll go through what these different images represent. The middle one, which I don't expect you to be able to read, is just a spreadsheet of all of the different steamships and other vessels that he worked on outside of America when he lived in England between 1857 and 1872. Raised on the waterways of North Carolina, John Jacobs spent 17 out of his 33 years of post-slavery life at sea, meaning he didn't just work as a sailor for 17 years. He was sleeping on a boat somewhere in the world on the water for 17 years of his life, more time than he spent on land. In 1839, and these are the two images on the left, he escaped by boat from Manhattan to New Bedford, where he signed up for a whaling voyage to the Pacific to distance himself from his owner, and he came back 4 years later a professional sailor. From 1856, when he left Australia for the UK, until 1872, when he returned to the US for what proved to be the final year of his life, he worked more than 35 voyages as a steward, which is sort of like a combination chef and gentleman's servant, on merchant ships that were transporting goods to and from England. So why is that interesting? Why does this belong as part of his biography? Well, he was shipping sugar from St. Kitts, oranges from the Black Sea, cotton from Egypt and India. It's remarkable that he was circling the globe over and over again during a moment when, if we don't think about it too much, we think, oh, people in the 19th century must have been not very mobile because they didn't have the kinds of technology we have now. They weren't able to get on a jet and then go to Hong Kong in 14 hours. And yet, someone like this probably circled the globe and traveled more than almost anyone in this room will travel for any of our entire lives. It's also interesting because there's a different type of history that plays out when we start to look at the work he's doing. This is not just a comparative history of, say, what were the systems of discipline and punishment like on board these ships? How did they remind him of the systems of discipline and punishment he found in slavery? How did they also put that in contrast because of their differences? It's also the fact that in the Civil War, during a moment when England is questioning where it should be getting its cotton from to feed the mills that are producing the clothing that is being sent around the world and other cotton garments and goods, he's working ships that go to Egypt and India, the places where England might be getting its cotton from if it chooses to abandon America, the Confederacy, and the Deep South, which was the other large cotton producer. So he's bringing back, he's almost like a spy, bringing back information to London, to the kinds of abolitionists we usually know as people who give strong, condemning speeches against slavery or tell their life stories in the manner of John Jacobs, but a lot softer because of reasons I'll get into. So all of these things are fascinating. In fact, when he was going to Egypt, he was shipwrecked off the coast of Egypt. When he was sailing to Cuba, he found out that the boat he was on was trying to run guns into South Carolina. And when he was down in the hold doing his job, he said, what are these long, skinny boxes that look like the exact shape of a box you would put rifles in? And then when the boat stopped in Nassau in the Bahamas, and he realized this wasn't on the itinerary, we were supposed to go straight to Cuba, he actually went before a judge in a police court and said, I don't want to go to Charleston, South Carolina. I know that, he probably didn't say this in court, but any black sailor knew that to go to Charleston, whether you were a fugitive slave or free, meant that the chances of you being enslaved were extremely, extremely high, that at least you would not have a say over what happened to you there. He was successfully won his case and was discharged, even though the Bahamas were super, super Confederate because their economy increased tenfold during the Civil War because they were the chief transshipment point for smuggling goods into the Confederacy. And somehow, on his own power, John Jacobs was able to get out of a predicament that many people would have succumbed to. A few voyages later, he helped complete the transatlantic telegraph line. He even sailed a special gift from England to the new King of Siam, a gunboat, and that King of Siam is the king that is now best remembered in the movie The King and I. So on average, he spent about 10 months at sea and 2 in London during this 15-year period. So if you've watched a movie like Forrest Gump is kind of the Hollywood, kind of sentimental, saccharine version of a historical novel. It's about a seemingly ordinary person who just winds up, seemingly by chance, intersecting with all of these major historical events. And it seems like, oh, this person maybe has a charmed life. But if you read a good historical novel or watch a good historical film, one of the things that this genre does is it shows that that seemingly ordinary person didn't wind up there by chance. That history is a series of processes that are working on all of us and connecting all of us in different ways at different times. And that ordinary people actually often play extraordinary roles in producing these historical events. The books you read in a history class may not be able to reconstruct what that average individual was doing, why that average person is actually not average, but should be remembered. And someone like John Jacobs is maybe an exemplary figure for this. He led exactly this kind of life. He was extraordinary in so many ways, and yet if I hadn't accidentally stumbled upon his autobiography, or if someone else hadn't accidentally stumbled upon it, we would have no knowledge about him. He would just be a minor character in the biography of his sister still. So if these incidents in his life suggest why I decided to write a biography of this man to accompany his autobiography, we should also remember that his own words constitute the strongest proof of who he was and what he stood for. For John Jacobs wrote and spoke fearlessly. In fact, Despots speaks truth to power in ways that few Black Americans, save Frederick Douglass and David Walker, have ever been able to do. And I'm not saying that that's not a condemnation against Black Americans and not a way of saying they are unable to come up with the words, but rather within the space called America, that space curtails what can be said. I view John Jacobs as a radical truth teller what the ancient Greeks called a parrhesiast, a person who has the courage to tell the truth, all the while knowing the risks involved in doing so. For Jacobs, violence was the most obvious of these risks, but less obvious was the possibility that by telling the truth, he exposed himself to the possible psychic damage of finding out that most US citizens did not want to imagine a nation that included him. It is just such a manner of speaking truth to power that I believe John and Harriet Jacobs learned from Frederick Douglass and fellow abolitionists in Rochester in the late 1840s, where they all lived. And I bring up Rochester because I mentioned Frederick Douglass a second ago. So Frederick Douglass in 1847 moves to Rochester, New York, and he founds maybe one of the two most important abolitionist newspapers of all time, the North Star, the beacon of freedom. And he does so because he had been working with white abolitionist run organizations and found that it was frustrating to be told to basically go up on speech and perform his life story and just tell the facts, and then the people running the organization would say, we'll take care of the philosophy. He found that condescending and insulting, especially if we think of Frederick Douglass, we think of nothing but a virtuoso orator and rhetorician, someone who was able to hold crowds in spaces like this, not for the 30 minutes I'm hopefully going to speak for, but for 3 to 3.5 hours speaking alone without a microphone. Douglass went to Rochester, I would contend, because what is Rochester next to? Next to Canada. If there were people that came after him because of what he said, he was 2 hours away from touching down in Ontario. I think Ontario is across from Rochester, or at least somewhere in Canada, Quebec otherwise. As a former slave, John Jacobs refuses to depict the way that slavery dehumanized him. He even refuses to lay 100% of the blame at the slave owner's feet. Not only does his autobiography zero in on the stark injustice of owning humans, but he does so for a higher end, to prove that slavery and racial caste are written into the conceptual bedrock of the American Republic, starting with the Constitution, which he calls the bulwark of American slavery. This is another reason why this text and John Jacobs are really interesting, because what's going to happen in 2026? America's going to turn 250, and there's going to be a lot of celebrations, and you can imagine, given our political climate, that it's going to be pretty contested about what should be remembered of American history, what should be ignored, what should be banned and censored, etc. Many parts of America, many rooms where the Constitution is read, are going to cut out the things that John Jacobs might say about American history. He writes, "The slave's life is a lingering death, not simply because 600,000 legalized robbers, the number of slave owners in America plus their families, operate a violent, abusive system of labor exploitation, but because American law permits them to do so. And since," he continues, "the law is the will of the people, a mirror to reflect a nation's character, he holds all American citizens, not just Southerners, but also Northerners, accountable for writing authoritarianism, in his word, despotism, into a democratic charter. That devil in sheepskin called the Constitution of the United States, which contains and tolerates the blackest code of laws in existence," these are his words, "represents the great chain that binds the North and South together, a union to rob and plunder the sons of Africa, a union cemented with human blood and blackened with the guilt of 68 years. And we don't have to look very far to know what he's talking about if we're thinking historically by the middle of the 19th century, the vast majority of clothing worn by slaves, which was manufactured out of the cotton that some of those slaves picked, was manufactured here in Rhode Island and then sent back south. How does a state like Rhode Island disentangle itself from something like slavery if it benefits so much economically? Well, it turned out that it took a war to do so. Hopefully, if we run into problems like this in our future, it will not. In taking to heart the radical abolitionist position that the transformation of the United States from a slave state into a free society could not be achieved through politics within the Union, and so radical abolitionists actually believed the Constitution was so written in favor of the slave states that any formal political participation was bound to fail, and that the only thing that you could do was give speeches and change the hearts and minds, the morality of people, to see if that would make a difference. They called for basically a different type of politics within the Union, an informal politics. John Jacobs, however, chose a different route. He chose to pursue politics without the Union, without being in the US. Writing from beyond the reach of American law and outside the heavy hand of the white abolitionist editor, who often kind of served as, we would say, a gatekeeper to the keys to publication, and often said, you have to write this, or soften your words, or not write this in order to publish your life story. John Jacobs demonstrates the potential of unfiltered, unapologetic black writing to speak these truths. If the American flag is to be planted on the altar of freedom, he writes at the beginning of the Civil War from London, then I am ready to be offered on that altar if I am wanted. But if it must wave over the slave with his chains and fetters clanking, let me breathe the free air of another land and die a man and not a chattel. The recovery of despots gives us an unprecedented chance to understand how, outside American law and humanitarian authority, African Americans reconfigured the relationship between liberty and truth. And I might add that also if you come from, say, an Italian American or an Irish American background, and you look at the middle of the 19th century, you look at the rhetoric of someone like Daniel O'Connell, some of the rhetoric of a Garibaldi, you will see how there was an international movement for liberation and independence that many people of different stripes and beliefs and persuasions were caught up in. That is incredibly powerful and moving and worth thinking about holistically. Beyond American power, Jacobs is speaking truth to American power in a life story built on the conviction that words can ring so true as to build new build new worlds. And he would sign his letters to Frederick Douglass, yours for the truth, or yours in liberty. With a constitution and union like this, he writes, what hope of freedom is there left for the slave? When shown your oppressive laws, you point us to the Congress of the United States, as if something could be done there. What has Congress ever done for freedom? You might say, based on recent years, that they've used the word a lot and not produced a lot of it. He continues, give me liberty with a cannibal rather than slavery with a professed Christian. And here he's talking about how an entire branch of Christianity that endorsed slavery ruled over the South, to the point that many abolitionists argued whether the law or Christianity were more responsible for entrenching slavery in America. No man should hold unlimited power over his fellow man. So it goes without saying almost that when I did find this autobiography, I wasn't looking for it because I would, just like when the thing you find in your dorm room is the last thing that you're looking for. That's just a lot of logical consequence that you don't start. You stop looking when you found the thing, and also you wouldn't need to find a thing if you knew it was there. I was working on a completely different book about the history of nostalgia because I teach a class at RISD called Nostalgia at the End of the World that's about just the question, why is nostalgia so prevalent nowadays, seemingly increasingly prevalent as crises mount and increase. But I was curious about the fact that in the 18th and 19th centuries, nostalgia didn't mean what it meant today. And in fact, the only person who would speak that word and say something is nostalgic would be a physician, because nostalgia referred to a disease in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the people who were nostalgic were only the people who had been forcibly displaced from home, that had been taken from their homes against their will. And this was common in the 18th and 19th centuries. People were conscripted and made to join the army. They were press-ganged and made to join a ship. They were enslaved. They were taken across the Atlantic in many cases and found themselves 3,000 miles away without the possibility of returning. If they reacted strongly and resisted, if they tried to run away, if they tried to drown themselves, if they tried to go in a hunger strike, a physician working for one of these institutions might say, oh, this is a clear case of nostalgia. Because to diagnose someone with nostalgia was a way of saying, oh, actually what they're saying is not something that we need to take seriously because they're suffering from a mental illness and they're not in their right mind. Therefore, what they need is medical care. The problem is not slavery. The problem is not the army. The problem is not the Navy or the Merchant Marines. The problem is this person and where they've come from, the home they came from, their racial background, their ethnic background. These are the problems that we need to be paying attention to according to these physicians. And so the diagnosis was a way of managing confined and captive populations. Because to be a soldier is to be part of a captive population. It's just that the way you're treated is different than if you're part of a different captive population. The goal of the army is to make as many people battle ready and healthy as possible so they can possibly die in the battlefield. The goal of the plantation and slavery is to get as much economic value out of an investment in a human life as possible, and then after that, that life is expendable, disposable. What I was curious about was, what about the people who were subject to this kind of diagnosis? What did they say about being subject to medical treatment that treated them as the problem, as a person with a weakness, a vulnerability, a person whose home was to blame, not what had happened to them? And so John Jacobs' sister's autobiography enters the picture here because, as I now know, both John and Harriet Jacobs knew a lot about medical care. They knew about the formal kind of medical care that their owner, the physician James Norcombe, would practice on his patients, the articles he would write for medical journals, which were often involved taking his slaves and performing pretty gruesome experiments on them. They also knew a lot about the informal medical care that enslaved peoples developed to take care of themselves because slavery was brutal and violent, and many people wound up hurt, needing bandages, needing dressings, needing salves. Those were the kinds of things that Harriet and John Jacobs could prepare. I was also reading Harriet Jacobs' biography at the time, which I've alluded to before, and I was just curious because I came across this little endnote, maybe like on page 225 it looks like, or actually probably later because this is referring to 224, which said that John Jacobs and his nephew, Joseph Jacobs, went to Australia to become gold miners, and that Joseph Jacobs didn't come back, possibly because he committed suicide. And for this project I was working on, I was just asking myself, well, was there a similar kind of physician in Australia that looked at this death, saw that Joseph Jacobs might tick the box as African American, and then assigned the cause of death as death from nostalgia, which was actually listed as a cause of death on death certificates in the 19th century. And this also extends to people who died after emigrating from Italy and Ireland. Sometimes acute melancholia or nostalgia was listed as the cause of death. The Jacobs men, both of them, had gone to Australia. They'd gone first to California to try their luck in the gold rushes. We don't learn that Australia has a concurrent gold rush to the California gold rush of 1849. But once you learn about that, you start to see that the modern shape of the Pacific Rim, which connects Asia, Australia, and the Americas, really begins to take shape when tens of thousands of people are taking ships back and forth between these gold rushes, or to the sites of these gold rushes. So it turned out that Joseph Jacobs did not commit suicide. Turned out there were many people named Joseph Jacobs who emigrated to Australia in the 19th century. Not that surprising to hear. It's a pretty generic name. But I also thought I could probably solve this minor mystery of his fate by just doing what Jean Fagan Yellen wasn't able to do, that's the biographer, wasn't able to do in the 80s and 90s, which is literally not leave my couch and see if there's a digital database on my laptop that I can access of Australian historical documents that I can just type a few search terms into and see if I can find Joseph Jacobs. Turned out there was a big publicly available, freely available database put together by the National Library of Australia. And so I began plugging in the search terms. I quickly realized that Joseph Jacobs is too generic, even if you put quotes around it. And then, oh, what about his uncle? Maybe because we know his middle initial is S, it'll be a more unique search term with quotes around it. And I also knew that the software that recognizes page images of newspapers misrecognizes what's on the page a lot, so you have to search for spelling variants. And I figured maybe I'll come up with a document that mentions both of them, mentions something about what they're doing in Australia, because that's what newspapers are good for, reporting on small things that happen on a daily basis. So then this happened. And this is something that I was not prepared for at all, which is this spelling variant turned up this hit. And I think I was in a small grandparents' apartment on the 3rd floor of an apartment in New Haven, which is like Providence but without fun. And my experience of New Haven, it's arguable if Providence has as much fun as we need, but New Haven definitely has no fun. So the first two hits actually were this title, The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, and then this curious byline, By a Fugitive Slave. The next one also said the same thing. There was a little parentheses that said the number of words on this earlier version of this website. It was 11,000 words. And I was that's not a newspaper article. And then this was 10,000 words. I was unless this is the advertisements at the end of the paper, all condensed into one article, also not a newspaper article. Because, as I also mentioned, grad school teaches you to be masochistic and to not have fun, which is probably why Yale's in New Haven. Not where I went to grad school, but it was also not fun. I concealed any possible excitement at this moment and was just it says By a Fugitive Slave. This looks to be something spectacular, but I still haven't figured out what this has to do with John Jacobs. And so where does that name appear? Even, I also am like, search terms are increasingly unreliable as search engines are trying to make you find the things they want you to find. And so even a Boolean search with quotes around it is not always effective. And I don't know anything about this site. So maybe it's trying to take me a place that I don't want to go. And maybe there is no John S. Jacobs, and it's just John up here, Jacobs down here. Anyways, skepticism is good. It's not a friend of pleasure, I suppose, but to be radically skeptical of the world around you will teach you a lot and make you a more curious, better, more examined person. So I clicked, and then I saw this. And I was like, okay. I actually saw this with a little box that you see on your laptop where you feel claustrophobic because you only see like one tiny portion of this entire thing. And then this is, so what you're looking at is this is the first hit, and then this is the second. They correspond to 2 different days of the 2 different issues of the newspaper, and they were, because his autobiography was published across 2 days. So the thing you do when you're excited but want to conceal your excitement and verify your research is you start skimming really quickly and not really reading, but just seeing if things catch your eye. And so I scrolled through or scanned down column by column. And one thing I started noticing is that names from the biography I'd just been reading started to flow by. And that's notable already for one thing. It doesn't tell me, it tells me circumstantially that this is probably John Jacobs. It's not a smoking gun. But also in reflection, what it tells me is that he's using the actual names of people. He's not using pseudonyms. He's not saying Mr. S to try to say something bad about Mr. S. He's saying Mr. Sawyer or Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, and nobody is changing that because, as we now can say, there's nobody to censor him. He's in Australia, and it's to the editor's credit that on the periphery of British Empire, they did not censor what he's saying. And that's a big deal because when you read Harriet Jacobs' autobiography, all of the characters have been given pseudonyms, possibly to protect the press or the publisher against libel and slander laws within the US, possibly to protect Harriet Jacobs from being identified. So I kept scrolling through, and then I hadn't come across what my search hit was referring to. But then I came across, about 3/4 of the way down the first installment, I came across this note. And I apologize in advance. I'll probably swear here because this note is very powerful and exciting and I think deserves a curse or two. Left on the bed of his owner, Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, a congressman from North Carolina, and in a, to say the least, complicated manner, the father of his sister's 2 children, the father who did not legitimize, emancipate, or otherwise take care of those 2 children. The note reads, "Sir, I have left you not to return. When I have got settled, I will give you further satisfaction. No longer yours, John S. Jacobs." Before getting into any analysis, let's just look at that sign-off, because that's what we call the end of a letter or the end of an email. It's a sign-off. There's probably a formal term for that. But you often sign off, some people will sign off and say, "Yours, Bill," which is a term of affection or endearment, to be in the possession of someone else. Maybe you're saying, "My emotions, my heart, my love is in your possession." To say "no longer yours" is far more than the opposite. It is to say, "I am no longer in your possession. I am still operating within the rules of politeness here, and yet I'm giving you an order. I'm telling a slave owner, as someone from the position of someone who has been owned by this person, I am not yours, which is not something that a slave can say when they're in the position of being a slave, because the slave owner rules by force, and the slave does not have agency, autonomy, freedom. This is the biggest fuck you possible. A polite fuck you. It's hard to do that, but he pulls it off so well. If we were to, like, what I wasn't thinking at the time when I found this is the moment when I did get excited, and it was like getting punched in the stomach, but in a good way. All the breath was sucked out of me. What I wasn't really thinking about, though, at that time, in 2016, is that when John Jacobs escapes from the Ritzy Hotel in Manhattan, the Astor Place Hotel, and he walks to Battery Park Wharf to take basically like a ferry to Providence, and then takes overland travel to New Bedford, all in a really perfectly executed escape that we wouldn't really say is the kind of escape that you imagine when you think about the Underground Railroad. There you think of desperation, fleeing by night, hiding in the woods. This is someone who walked slowly and almost as if casually out of a hotel with a suitcase in his hand because he had pulled off a stunt, a ploy, and fooled everyone around him and planned everything so well that went off without a hitch. However, in 1839, when all this happened, he did not write this note. He did not write his own Declaration of Independence because he was illiterate. The laws of North Carolina and the laws of many slave states prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write and penalized anyone from teaching them to read and write. So that's 1839. This, obviously, that we're looking at behind the note was published in 1855. In 1855, he writes the note. And so if we've been reading his life story up to this point, what this note is saying is not only he is declaring his own independence, but also he has been able to declare his own independence in a different manner because of the 16 years and how he has used that time since escaping from slavery. He has come a great distance from 1839 to 1855. And really, a lot of Black autobiography written by formerly enslaved people brings up this question. Can you be free if you can't write? Can you be free if you don't have the powers to articulate yourself to others, both in speech and in writing? For someone like John Jacobs or Frederick Douglass, the answer is no. The answer is that is not liberation. That is just to be free from a condition. That is not a positive sense of freedom. So it's really, I think, remarkable also that if this note measures the distance between 1839 and 1855, it also measures the distance between 2016, when I found it, in 1855. Because this note in 1855 proved that John Jacobs is the author of his own life story and that he has developed a way of embodying and enacting freedom. But in 2016, it proves for us that he is the author of his life story and that we can say this is by not just a fugitive slave, but John Jacobs. And it's for this reason that I would say that this kind of writing represents a spectacular performance of freedom. And let's think of that word spectacular, not in the glib way we usually use it, but in the sense of a spectacle. He's making a spectacle of himself, he's exhibiting himself, but he has supreme control over how he's doing it. And this note I choose not just because it's so memorable, but also because it epitomizes two of the narrative's most remarkable aspects. The first has to do with Jacobs' use of performance. So, have you had to read any autobiographies in an English class or history class that's not a slave narrative? What kind of texts have you read? Like the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin or like other texts? Shout out a name or two if you have. What's that? Well, all right. Not as forthcoming as I thought. What's that? Anne Frank? Okay. Oh, that's what he said. What's that? St. Augustine. St. Augustine is great. That's a perfect one, actually. When we think of autobiography, I think generally we think a story about one's life written by oneself. We think that this is a story that narrates the key plot points and events of one's life that have made that person that person. We also think that there's going to be a certain style to it because we want to get access to who that person is through their creative and deliberate narration, the way that they string events together. However, when someone like Harriet Jacobs or John Jacobs, if they were seeking to write their autobiography, they were told the exact opposite. Narrate the plot of your life with the key events, but constrict it or constrain it just to the things that are supposed to help bring about the end of slavery. Basically, this takes us back to tell us the facts, we'll take care of the philosophy. Just tell us the bare things that can be were publicly witnessed, it could be that you eyewitnessed, or that happened to you, about that concern slavery and that put slavery in the worst light possible, but also tell it truthfully and factually. Unlike typical autobiographies, unlike that type of autobiography that formerly enslaved people were supposed to write, Jacobs does something I think really special, which is he reduces the account of his autobiographical experience to a minimum. He doesn't put in as many plot points. He doesn't say, here's all the bad things that happened to me, here's the pain I felt, here's the pain that others felt around me, but rather he wants to create space in his narration for critiquing slavery and for narrating his own life on his own terms. So why did I say performance? Because to write something that performs who you are at the moment of writing in 1855 or in 2025, is in some ways always autobiographical, always historical, because we are all composites of history that we carry with us. If we weren't, life would be a lot easier. We are composites of the bad history that we've inherited, the world we live in, the families we live in, we come up in, the institutions we're a part of. There's good things and bad things about them. But we are inevitably bundles of all those things with all their contradictions and complications. So at the moment that we're writing or that we're performing, we are all of those things at once. And yet, if we've spent years training ourselves, giving speeches, telling our life story, writing it down on paper, then we also bring a certain set of analytical, elocutionary, rhetorical skills with us that is also on display. And that's kind of the display, showing an audience what you've made yourself into, how you've unlearned or reworked or reformed the bad parts of the history that you carry with you, and how all the events in your life have led up to who you are now. That is performing. That is different than saying, here are the events that led up to who I am now. Finally, by absolutely refusing the expectations placed upon ex-slave authors to portray the horrors of slavery through graphic depictions of their own sufferings in slavery, Jacobs is able to perform his life rather than describe it. He refuses to repeat the experience of slavery in a new format because he doesn't believe that by showing how he was dehumanized, that that's going to do anything more than make some readers feel like they've already done something good by having feelings of pity and sympathy while reading the thing. He doesn't believe that any person is going to read sentimental descriptions and go about and enact political change. In this book, Who John Jacobs is located in how John Jacobs writes. In his style, which he began cultivating on board that whaling ship where he taught himself to read and write. In William Cooper Nell's Boston, Nell was an important black abolitionist who ran virtually all black abolitionists and self-improvement organizations, and Frederick Douglass's Rochester, where he developed his rhetorical and analytical skills. And, though it's less visible, in the clamorous protest culture of Pacific gold miners and the British Empire's sailors. For John Jacobs, autobiography is a style and a manner of performing freedom. The defiant eloquence of despots epitomizes who he has become, testifies to how far he has come, and casts a sharp light on how much he has overcome. Read in this light, we begin to see how this autobiographical style is part and parcel of John Jacobs' education as an abolitionist. For he does not just showcase his talents as a writer and speaker. It's not just a performance of who he is, but rather he uses this performance and his talents to denounce American authoritarianism, refusing to yield to pressures to represent black pain in order to incite white anti-slavery sentiment. Jacobs instead draws up a revolutionary contract between text and reader, calling North Carolina slave owners and Washington politicians out by name, exposing Northern complicity, exposing the fact that, for example, maybe some of those factory owners in Rhode Island who were manufacturing the cloth that slaves wore chose to turn a blind eye to this so that they could keep reaping profits. And finally, arguing that the nation's founding documents represent the foundation of American slavery. If slave owners can be considered an evil, he writes, they are a necessary evil, and you can only remove the evil by removing the cause, namely the laws that uphold and condone and permit this institution to exist. When he submitted his autobiography to a London magazine in 1860, however, they cut out the final quarter of his autobiography, which is a 5,000-word critique of America's founding documents, which is the most sustained demonstration of his talents and his most urgent call for justice. And if we think that a place where he's no longer narrating the events of his life, that's probably the best place for performing who he is, then they're also eliminating what is most autobiographical about this different sort of autobiography. While he began developing his life story in the late 1840s in Rochester, it is this section that he wrote all or most of when he walked into the Empire office in Sydney and asked for an abolitionist history of the United States, recently completed, and the newest copy of the US Constitution. Remarkably, this concluding part of the narrative, the 1855 one, abandons any attempt to narrate individual experience in favor of delivering readings of the Constitution, Declaration, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. He calls these readings interlineations. And I think we should hear in that word reading between the lines. And I think we should hear in that word an allusion to Frederick Douglass's narrative where no one is teaching him to read and write, or at least virtually no one. So he starts stealing the son of his master's spelling books. And they've already been filled in because the master's son is able to go to school and is able to learn to read and write. So he takes the pencil and he writes in between the lines because space is not made for him. Similarly, later on, when he has to go into the streets of Baltimore during the winter, and the fingers grow so frostbitten that he said you could lay a pencil between the grooves and cracks in my fingers, I think we should also hear a word like interlineation. These readings or interlineations resemble nothing so much as David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which is the text that is said to really ignite the Black radical tradition and is really one of the texts that should be read alongside this one because it is so outspoken and because it was a favorite text among sailors like Jacobs, and one that sailors in New York, Boston, Providence would actually take this political pamphlet, sew it into the linings of their jackets, and because they knew they were working shipping routes that went from the north to the south, when they got out in Charleston or they got out in North Carolina or in Virginia, they would unsew the lining of their jackets, take out the pamphlet, probably go to, let's say, a warehouse space where there's a group of people there, some of whom are literate, some illiterate, and they would read out this pamphlet to people gathered there. And it was considered so controversial by the pro-slavery South that people found with this document in their possession were imprisoned, fined, even hanged for when it was found. And so here's just one example right here of one of these interlineations, the way that John Jacobs delivers it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Familiar so far. We'll be hearing everyone reading this out loud in 2026. We won't be hearing this, which is from the original Constitution, read out loud in 2026. That no slave held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So this isn't in our Constitution now, but it was basically a win for the slave states in the drafting of the Constitution that they got this fugitive slave clause in there, which said that no slave could escape to another state and then be free. That there had to be some mechanism for recapturing a fugitive slave and bringing them back to their master. To secure these rights, we're back on familiar territory. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, excluding Indians and free Negroes. Not so familiar. I might just highlight two things that are happening in these interlineations. One is kind of obvious. It's kind of a mashup or a splicing together of different parts of these documents. To what end, we might say? Well, what happens when we read the most universal declarations of the freedom of Americans and then juxtapose it against the fact that quite clearly many Americans were not enjoying the benefit of these universals? There's also another subtle operation that he's performing on these texts that unless you have a copy of the original Constitution next to you, you probably don't notice. Notice that it says no slave held to service or labor in one state. The word slave does not appear in the Constitution. famously or infamously, when slaves are referred to, for example, that they're not treated as the value of a full person for voting purposes, but as 3/5 of a person, they're called a person, which is kind of a dodge by many of the founding figures who wrote the Constitution. And I think in the Madison Papers, you can find some discourse about this question. Should we mention the word slave or just say person? Jacobs makes it explicit who they're talking about. Similarly, excluding Indians and free Negroes also reiterates the fact that this is a partial document that is passing itself off as a universal document. And so when he writes, he trains us, his readers, to understand that he writes between the lines of American law, and that he does so not as a citizen, but as a stranger, a person who does not benefit from these laws because they were not written for him, and because as an exile, they no longer apply to him. From outside America, John Jacobs writes back against a nation that had made it impossible for him to live freely within it, that had enslaved him in the South, refused him liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness in the North, and after 1850, destroyed any hopes he might have of living as an autonomous, sovereign individual in America. All right, so I will conclude briefly, just to try to bring it back to our present, and also to bring it back to John Jacobs' language. And I think it's funny, like now, every time, if I write something and it's a few months old, it already seems really dated. So what I'm about to say, I'm gonna revise in real time, which is basically like 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago even, when the rolling back of civil rights in America was starting to become relatively apparent, news outlets kind of conditioned us to think that what was happening was that there were extremists that were approaching from the outside. And I don't think we would say that anymore. All of the so-called extremists of January 6th have been pardoned now, formally. But even if we were to take a time machine back 5 or 10 years and read this document and read John Jacobs' life, we might learn a lesson to not look to the outside, to not think that there are these malevolent, evil forces that are somehow elsewhere that are infiltrating and affecting us. For John Jacobs lived in a world of encroaching extremism in which slave owners, politicians, and Northerners who financially benefited from slavery worked out pro-slavery deal after pro-slavery deal. In 1820, 1833, and 1850, that were anything but equal compromises, that word that we often get in our high school history books. For Jacobs, rising authoritarianism is no outlier, no incursion from outside, but a logical consequence of America's institutions and laws, beginning with the Constitution and Declaration. So we can start to return this remarkable individual and his life story to the heart of an America that has forgotten him. We can now imagine what his sister's autobiography would have been like if she had gone to California with him, as she had talked about doing in 1850, but then was unable to do so because of the fact that she was working as a governess and a nurse on an estate in the Hudson River Valley, and because during her own escape from slavery, she hid in an attic for almost 7 years, which was a display of willpower, but also a display that gave her chronic mobility issues for the rest of her life, gave her a chronic disability. Looking outside the nation by taking off the blinders of ideology, as John Jacobs did, means writing back against the myth of the United States of America as a nation that progressively eradicates the legacy of its original sin through the development of its democratic institutions, and the enfranchisement of its citizens. Taking John Jacobs at his word requires taking seriously the claim that in 1776, as I will say again, the American nation embarked on two experiments simultaneously, one in democracy, the other in tyranny. Perhaps, as the real possibility of democracy dying in darkness seems to be at our doorstep, the words of despots have taken on a new urgency as we work to figure out what can be done. I'll end by reciting John Jacobs' final words in Despots. In conclusion, let me say that the experience of the past, the present feeling, and above all this, the promise of God, assure me that the oppressor's rod shall be broken. But how it is to be done has been the question among our friends for years. After the prayers of 25 years, the slaves' chains are tighter than they were before, their escape more dangerous, and their cups of misery filled nearer their brim. Since I cannot forget that I was a slave, I will not forget those that are slaves. What I would have done for my liberty, I am willing to do for theirs, whenever I can see them ready to fill a free man's grave, rather than wear a tyrant's chain. The day must come, it will come. Human nature will be human nature. Crush it as you may, it changes not. But woe to that country where the Son of Liberty has to rise up out of a sea of blood. When I have thought of all that would pain the eye, sicken the heart, make us turn our backs to the scene and weep, I then think of the oppressed struggling with their oppressors and have a scene more horrible still. But I must drop this subject. I do not like to think of the past nor look to the future of wrongs like these. God save us from the blood of the innocent. I ask nothing more. Thank you.
We hope that you can continue the conversation with us down the hall at the reception. Thank you all for coming out, and please give another round of applause for Dr. Schroeder.